Hi, Michelle. I'm Sonali. How are you? Hope you're doing good. Okay. So, I guess we'll get started. We're a little light, maybe because I got a little delay in posting, but I wanted to test everything. Okay, so we are going to use Linux virtual machine. Hi, Ghislaine. If you want to go ahead and boot up your Linux virtual machine to do that. You can also do this in your Windows environment, your IDE, but just making sure that your Python is linked properly. So just if you have your Linux virtual machine, it's easier. Okay, and check out the lab. Let's share screen real quick. So what I want to do is to use this lab to show you how you can actually use API with web requests. And mainly because that's the reality of how this would be incorporated using the request library. You can elevate it by doing parallel processing, but in this one, we're just going to use it to you access website, be able to post and do a put, and then also to be able to do try and accept for in the case where you run into errors. So in the web scraping process, you usually would have to be able to pull files, but I want you to be able to understand how to incorporate API with your web requests in Python. So this is lab 11. And in this lab, sorry, I forgot to remove this. I originally wanted to use other packages, but we are going to use requests and we are going to parse things in JSON. This is the common practice when you're using request library or doing any kind of HTTP requests. We are going to also use Restful Api. And just to give you a little bit of background in REST API, in that REST API is an application programming interface that conform to the architecture of REST. And that allows you to interact with web services. And REST stands for Representational State Transfer, which is incorporated with the API to define different set of instructions and protocols in the application software. Things that we often use is when you authenticate to like GitHub using your Google Authentication. Google Authentication API is then incorporated with that particular website. Now, what we want to do is we want to use the API to be able to access data content and also like generating queries, being able to put in forms, like fill out information. And so you can automate some of this process through Python. So this is going to walk you through the basics. Okay. So, and then if you continue to read that, it says that it's establishing the content required for the consumer and the content that's required by the producer, which is going to be the call and the response. It helps you communicate what you want to the system and understand how to really fulfill the request. It is a mediator between the user and the client and the resources or the web services that they want to get. So another advantage in this is that you don't have to have caching in order to really get the resources that you need. So when you submit a request that's made with RESTful API, it transfers the representation state of the resource to the requester endpoint. So usually it's going to be delivered in JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, and or you can have it in HTML, XLT, Python, PHP, or plain text. JSON is the most common popular file format that's used because it is language agnostic. It can be used across different languages, and it is very readable to us and the machine. So in the parameters and the headers that we're going to be using, we need to implement HTTP methods like what we read about with get, with put, with post. So with that, we are able to identify the type of information, the data, the authorization, and so on. So this can be used with cookies, caching, and so many different things. And this is what you see with web development today, not just in websites, but also with web applications. So in the web requests, recall that there are 4 major tasks. One is going to be get, the second is put, and the third is post, and then ultimately we have delete when we can remove data. Now, when you're working with REST API, prior to that, it talks about endpoint and method. So the endpoint is the URL that delineates what data that you want to interact with. So that will be the URL that's tied to a certain website. Okay. And then the method we talked about get, put, post, and delete, and that's going to come from the request library. So now when you are using the methods, you would utilize data. So either you want to be able to obtain data, be able to add data to the site, which eventually goes into the database. So you can do put post, or you can also remove data. Now the headers, which contain any metadata that needs to be included with the request, such as authentication tokens. So if you have access tokens, that can be included, or any of the content type that will be returned based on the caching policies. So when the server, when it's responding, it's going to give you what you're asking, right? So it says that when you're performing a request, you get a response from the API. And just like any request, it'll have the response header and the response data. Now, the header would consist of metadata that might be useful, and you would see that in this particular lab, while the response data returns what you are actually asking. So this can be any type of data. A lot of the times we are going to look for specific things like what we see in the queries, and we would set the parameters using arguments. So the text is going to be returned as JSON, and you can also parse this and put it into an XML format. But what we're going to see is we're going to see the output of it in command line as we're going to run our script in command line. So with that said, we can boot our virtual machine in Linux, and we are going to open up the terminal. We are going to do a couple of things. First, we are going to install the request module or the package, actually the module, and then we are going to also install curl if you don't have curl. If you took Raspberry Pi with me before, you've seen curl being used. So this is a way that we can use the curl, which is going to we're going to be able to execute it directly through the command using curl. So that's one way of you using an API, which is an Open Notify API. And it's going to be able to to give you information about astronauts as we are gonna pull some data from there. Okay, so here, let's go into our virtual machine. Okay, so once I log in, I'm just gonna go ahead and, sorry, my VM crashed earlier as I was doing something else with it. Let's hope that it's gonna go. All right, good. um, okay. So here, what we'll do is we'll just start with the pip3 install request with an S. And of course, in Linux, you can also use sudo apt-get install. That will be fine too for Debian. Okay, and if you have pip, you can use pip3. And if you don't have pip, it'll tell you to install pip and you need to install pip. So then what we're going to do next is that will be our step 3. We're going to install curl. So we would do sudo snap install curl, and it's going to ask you to authenticate as, okay. And that would take like a minute for it to download and install. It's going to ask you if you want to install, you just have to say yes. Okay, so once you have curl, you are going to use curl X. And we're going to put in the get command for HTTP and then the website. And notice that here is where we would use we would say that it's an API. Okay. And so that will be API and then the website. So open notify.org. And then we're going to put in the JSON. Astros.j and enclose that with the quotation mark. So anytime that you use the URL, you want to make sure that you use it with the quotation mark. So this is one way of us using the curl with get. Okay. And what it's giving you is the content that you're asking for, which is going to be astronauts. Okay. And these are the data field that we got from that particular website. So you can do it straight from command line, or we can do it as a script. So then what we're going to do next is we are going to open up Nano and we're going to write a script. And in that script, we're going to use our request library, and we are going to do the same thing just in Python. Okay. So let's call up nano test http.py. So it's pretty straightforward here. We have an import statement where we bring in the library. We have a variable called response, and it's going to store what we're going to retrieve or what we're going to obtain from that particular website or through API. Okay. And then we're going to print it. And just disregard my comment below because that's for the next part. So then what you have is you would have the, just to be able to get the output. So 3 lines for that. And here we are using the get HTTP. Okay. So once you have that written, Control X, yes, enter, and then we're going to run it. So it's going to give you the response in 200. And we know that 200 is that it successfully fulfilled your request. Okay. So normally the status code would then be provided. So if you get a 400 here, that means that you're getting an error. Okay. So when we run that, we're going to be able to get the response. So to do this, first you would want to start looking at what you wanted to, which website you wanted to use and be able to incorporate the API, right? To be able to pull, to be able to access that. So we basically submit a request for that website. You've seen that when we did the assignment already. Okay, then what we're going to do next is we are going to, so take a screen capture. What request status code is displayed? We got the 200. So here it tells you that the response object, which is this right here, right, contains all the data sent to the server in response to the GET request, including headers and data payload. So it prints out the response, which is in status code. And it's simply going to return that once it's fulfilled your request, which is GET. And after that, we wanted to see a little bit more of the data. So we would then use queries and parameters. And queries can be used to filter data that the API would return. So we would need to add in the parameters, and we want to be able to append it to the endpoint URL. So it is going to be in a dictionary format. So it is a dictionary object. And so what we want to do is we want to get some data content about the astronauts, right? About the flight for ISS. So here we're going to filter it down to 2 things. The latitude is going to be 45 degrees and the longitude is going to be 180 because they have that recorded. Okay. So we're going to come back here and we are going to edit our file. So you're going to do a nano test http.py again. So after the 3 lines that you have written, we are going to go ahead and create a query object. And our response is going to be the same thing. But in this time, we are going to add in the parameters. Okay. So just to make it a little larger, let's go here. So here you have to specify that this is a query by putting in the parameters. So you have to specify that. And we want to print our response as JSON. So That's why it's a little bit different than the last one. As we created the object here, right? We wanted to be able to use that object and add the attributes to it. So that will be JSON. So as we have completed that task, by adding 3 more lines, we're going to click Control X on our keyboard. Yes to save, enter. And then we're going to rerun it. So of course, we are going to get the response 200. That was the first part that we did. And we added on the query. So here it's going to give you the query response. So it tells you that we are here. We asked for, wait, what's it? The latitude is 45 and the longitude is 180. That was our criteria. And then so it's able to give you additional information based on that query. Okay. Now, writing a script like this, right, can be beneficial for a lot of different areas, from IT to development to cybersecurity, because sometimes you wanted to be able to use the script to be able to test, right, the security of a certain site, or it could be a web application, to see if it's actually giving you data like social security number, right? So from an attacker standpoint, they can also use something like this to start looking at some of the data content on your website. Okay. So once we have this, take a screen capture. So save and run your file and then take a screen capture. Okay. So what you have is you have a specific query that you created and the response for that query. Any question? Okay, so next, what we're going to do is we're going to use post and put. And as we talked about earlier, that your data is going to be a dictionary object. So in dictionary, you always going to have the key and the value. So this is why we want to specify that as our arguments. So then we are going to add this to our script. Okay. And that simply is also a different website. Okay. So we have to pick a site that's going to give you the capability to submit data to it. Okay. So what we do is we are going to put post and then we're going to do an update with it. So when you put, that's going to be update. So let's go here. And I'm going to use a different file because when we do them in stages, I wanted to be able to demo it. So we did the query from earlier. Okay. And now what we're going to do is we are going to do a post and a put. So notice here that you are using a post method and you want to specify your endpoint URL. Then after that, you would then specify the data. For the request put, we simply use the put method. And then we are gonna also follow that with a put here as the other one, the endpoint URL you wanted to do the post. Okay. So when the server, when it sees that, it's gonna know that you're going to add data to it. And then we would follow that just like the put with data is, and we would say that this is a dictionary key and value. And we want to print out something to validate that it's done, right? So we can print out the headers, which is going to give us the timestamp date. Okay, so as we add a few more lines, right, after you finish that, you are going to go ahead and save it. And then we're going to run it. So we have the headers here. This is going to be the time that it responds, right? Part of it anyway. So it tells you that at this time, right, the system responds. So as you do this with different site, you would be able to, you want some kind of confirmation. So you can play with like different headers field to be able to output that. But in this one, we're just going to examine print the date. I forgot to add that line. I'm sorry. Let me add that. Let me do a print. And then enclose date. And use double or single quotation mark. So don't forget to add this. Otherwise, it still executes, but you're not going to see the date headers. I'll re-upload this. Sorry. I thought I added it, but I forgot. So with that, we did two things. We used the post and the put. Post is going to allow you to add data to the site. Put is going to allow you to update the data. Any question? So now common that you would find REST APIs require authentication, okay, such as GitHub. You can actually get GitHub access token and be able to incorporate that. But I think for those of you who took 30B, you've seen this before a little bit. So in the next part, this one we don't have to do, but I wanted to also add this so you know how to be able to incorporate authentication. So it tells you here that REST API require you to authenticate to be able to access certain type of data. And there are quite a few common authentication approach. So the simplest way is that you have to put in your actual username and password. So when you see the authentication object, you would use a method called HTTP basic auth. And here is where you would put in your username and your password. But most of the time, it would be easier to really use the access token to be able to incorporate that, right? See, like how you will be able to use Facebook authentication on a different app, okay? That's what is incorporated. They actually overlay that with the authentication API access token. So you only have to authenticate to one website or one application, web application, and it's already generated an access token. So they coded it so that way it carries that access token for the next site through the API. Okay. So what you see here is that if you want to incorporate it, you can hard code it in. Okay. But a better way to do it is to use the access token and then use the access token method to be able to authenticate. So for 9, it actually goes over on how you can use sessions to manage access tokens. And we know that once we're authenticated, it creates a session, right? Like when you authenticate to your bank, in that secure session, what happens is you can do transfer, you can move money around, you can look at your transactions, and so on. So when we do this, what we're going to do is we're going to create session objects. And that's going to, this is going to be the object here. It's going to handle the session request. And for the authorization, we're just going to input the information or the parameter that's going to be using access token. So here it tells you that session objects come in handy when working Python requests as a tool to persist parameters that are needed for making multiple requests within a single session, like access token. Also, managing session cookies can provide a nice performance for the increase because you don't need to open new connection for every request. Because the cookie does store some of the information about that site, right? It does cache some of that. So that way you don't have to utilize additional space in order to store additional information about that particular web access. So this part now is where we would create a session object. And here we would use the superclass session. Then we're simply going to update the headers. And in the parameters, we want to specify that this is for the authorization. Okay. This will be the access token. Now, some sites, like when you're looking at GitHub, when you go into your GitHub settings, you can find access token for GitHub for your account. Okay, and you can use that to be able to apply that to other applications, other sites. So, for example, if you're using like REPL.it, it uses GitHub token. So once you authenticate to GitHub, it creates that access token for that user, and it would carry it to REPL.it. So how they program that is that they would be able to incorporate the access token through the authentication. Okay. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to add in 4 more lines. And when it responds, right, we're going to obtain the headers information, but we're not printing out anything from the headers. We just want to print the confirmation that it has been accessed. So let me comment this out or undo the comment here. And these type of script would often you would find that we would use it with HTTPS, right, for the secure, because it does create the session once you authenticate. So once we have that added, we would then save it. And we would run it. So the added element here is that I got confirmation, right? And you can play with it more. You can find a lot of different documentation on and exercises through request library itself. Okay, so here we would then show that it's accessed and also rest. Any question with this? Okay. Now, there might be, and know that they do change up the site, so the script might not work the next time, but here there's also a note. APIs calls don't always go as planned. There could be requests that might fail, and that could be the fault from your end or the server end. If you're using REST, you need to understand how to handle errors in the case if something happens, because you don't want your application to stop working, right? So we want to do try and accept. It sounds like one can use Python script to delete cookies and zip. Yep, you can definitely do that. You can do a lot of this and handle the cookies, the cache, or even read cookies, right? So some of the tools that you see in cybersecurity, it's written in Python because Python has abundant libraries, especially for web and also working with API and frameworks. So what you would see is you would see scripts and tools that have been written in Python, and you definitely find that. Like cookies analyzer, stuff like that. Even the scripts that it analyze the session headers, tools like that can be definitely written in Python. And you don't have to use, and third-party application, they would use Python to be able to write that. Okay. Okay. All right. So now we're going to come back to the Astros JSON, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to handle some error. In this step, you want to check for HTTP errors with Python requests. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the status code attribute to be able to check the error, because we know that it would be successful when it is 200. And when it receives an error, that will be the 400 to the 404. Okay. So when we add this on, it will just keep on running. And if everything goes well, right, it's going to say request is a success. But if it doesn't go well, if there's an error, then it would be 404. So what I want you to do when you do this part is when you edit your code, you would add these lines in, of course. Okay. Save it and run it. And then after that, what you can do is you can tweak it. You can modify the URL, the endpoint URL, like take out one of the letters and then run it. Save it and then run it and see if it's going to give you the results not found. Okay. Because when it runs normally like this perfectly, it'll just give you the request was a success. But we wanted to see if it actually goes to the else statement if we modify the URL. Okay. So that's what I put for the D here. You can modify the URL endpoint and then save the file and then run it. And then you should see this return. Okay. Okay, so come back here. Let me relog back in. Okay, so in this file, I added this section. And simply we reassign response, right, object or variable as we're going to get from this website, right? And we're going to we're going to make that request. And Astros, if you recall earlier, right, that's going to be for the astronauts information. If it is successful, it's going to give us the request of success. If it is not, if the status code is 404, results not found. Okay. So what we will do is we are going to go ahead and save it. run it. So as it is successful, right, it gives us the request was a success. Now let's tweak it. And I simply took out the S from Astros, right? And there you have it. It is a 404 now. So to test 404, you can nano back into your file and then go to the endpoint URL and then took out the S, right? Or put another letter there. You can also add another letter there and then save it and then run it. You should get result is not found. So we can quickly check, right, the response this way. Today is not too heavy duty. It's just going to be easy. Then for the next part, what we're going to do is we're going to put in statements that are going to allow us to catch exceptions. And in web applications, right, we want to be able to manage that. In the case where it runs across errors, we want to be able to handle it. Okay. Then for the next part, we are going to put in try except statement. So we redefine the response object, or you can use the same thing. You don't have to repeat that, but add it under try. So under try, we define response as a request to opennotify.org. And we are going to use raise for status. So if you read the section before, this function is used to handle errors. Okay. And then in accept, we would use request.exceptions, HTTP error as error. And then we will print out if there's error. So you can do it two ways. You can do it with the elif statement, like what we've done before, or you can do it with the try and accept. So coming back here, right? Let me exit out of this. And then let me nano into my fourth file. Okay. So we can add this, right? And then what you can do is you can go and modify this, just like what we've done before. Like this, like astro.json. And then we're gonna click Control X to save. Yes. And then we'll run it. What is Python? So as you can see, right, when we did earlier for the elif statement, I kept everything intact. So it says the request was a success. In the try and accept, I took out the S right after in the astrals, and it tells me that for client error, not found for URL, and it tells me the endpoint URL. And so subsequently, you can add a lot of different try or exceptions, right, criteria in your code like this. So here it talks about how we can handle redirections, we can handle timeout, we can handle, error. And so you can simply have it print out, right, the type of error as what you've seen as I output, the type of a connection error in the case that it runs into connection error. If it times out, if the server is busy and it doesn't respond, we can have it print out. And then we can also have it print out the error in the case where it comes across as a request exception. Okay, so those are some of the common errors that you would see. And of course, you can name this anything you want, right? But that we just wanted to use that to be able to store, right, the information so we can print that out. So if we add this, and as you can see, I have it. Okay. And then we can tweak it. We can play with it by changing the S, right, to something else, or modify the last part of our URL so you can see how it would be able to display the error. And if we take this out, save, and then we run. So there I have it. I have two errors, right? One for each part. So the first try and accept, we got this output because we took out the S from Astro, see? And then the second time with multiple accepts, right? That's the last part of the code is we also took out the S and it also gives me a 404 error. But the benefit of doing it this way, that you're able to handle a lot of different type of errors, right? Connection error, HTTP error. In the case if I fat finger my input, right? Or the server is busy, or in the case that it comes across certain exceptions from the server itself. So we want to be able to handle that with try and accept. Any question? And as you can see, what you can also do is you can save each of these as separate files and run it. I did it with different stages, so that way I can demo it for you. But you can put it all in one file and be able to do that. So altogether, it would look something like this. But in the middle, we did use a different website here. So through this lab, I hope that you're able to see how request library can be used in Python. You now know how to be able to write script for query and looking at how we can return, right, status code, along with looking at how we can print out header, like timestamp, and then be able to use it to handle errors from web servers or from the client. And of course, like I said, this is tip of the iceberg. You can also explore options on how to incorporate authentications, looking at cookies, looking at cache information, etc. Okay. And REST is, it gives you a lot of the details. This is really highly maintained by many developers. Their work group is great. So you can read more about it. I know for computer science, some classes at some university, they address this. I know at Cal State San Bernardino, one of the developer that contributes to this, he teaches one of the class there. You can also use URL-lib handling modules. I was going to incorporate this, but it, to really test everything and get it all working all together with what we have is a little bit more. So there are quite a few libraries that you can use with Python for web requests. Like this one, you can also look at like connections. This is actually an extension of the request module. So it can be specific to the URL. And then you can parse and so on. So any question? Okay, I see something in the chat. Suppose there's any code on YouTube I like to use, would be part of the project final. Yeah, you can reference it. Creator on YouTube, they usually they either put the content in their YouTube, or sometimes they will have a link to their own website or GitHub. Yeah, you can cite their sources. That's fine. Yeah, there's actually library for YouTube itself, right? Like if you take a class on machine learning with Python, I actually when I went to the data science conference for UCR, the event that they had for women in data science, I attended a little subsections where two students from UCR, I think they were either sophomore or freshman in the program. They showed how they use one of the library to be able to model. So what it does is it filter all the video and it's going to look for certain key phrase like I love computer science and or I love this. And then it actually filter out all the ums and the ahs on the video. And so it was really interesting. And so it outputs the content. And so they tested it. It was pretty cool. And they also showed they have a GitHub that have their source code and things like that. So you can do a lot with Python. All right. That's it for our lab. A few screen captures, and you can practice doing this. And then, a couple questions. So put it onto a document and you can upload it onto Canvas and you can submit that. Okay, and that's not due until Sunday. Also, don't forget, we have a quiz. So if you have extra time, go through the review game. And then next week, I'll give away the prize for the highest score. And then you can take the quiz. It is a little longer than the last quiz, but it's pretty easy. Most of the questions came from assignments and notes. So you can use your assignments as a reference as well. Quiz can be open notes, open book, but final exam will not be. So I plan to go over the final review maybe week 15 or 14. All depends on how we will be able to get some of the content completed. This class does have a lot more to address, so I'm going to try to double up on the next few chapters, and then so that way you will get all the content or the objectives fulfilled. Okay, so final exam will cover everything from the beginning to the end. You do have quiz 1 and quiz 2 cover, so that also gives you an idea of how the questions would be for the first part of the final. And then the last part of the final is going to cover the content that we don't have a quiz on. So like these last few chapters, that's going to be added to the final exam. So any question? Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. And then I'll let you go have your